Hi all, and today another introductory video, this time about the Renaissance. It's, let's say, the introduction to an introduction of obviously an eminently historiographical topic like the one of, determining what, as a matter of fact, is a Renaissance or the Renaissances, because this is a term that has been extended also not just to the better known Renaissance that is of the early modern era, but also to other periods in history that, because of a supposed, sometimes alleged progress or innovation, that were perceived so. So that's really the main discussion point. Were conceived as a moment of rebirth and therefore something to be celebrated, historically speaking, as a renaissance. And obviously this is a term that, if you really think about it, it's very used. It entered pretty much into popular culture. When you ask someone about the Renaissance, usually, at least in the place where I was born, people know what you're referring to. Maybe they don't know how to define it well. They don't have an idea of why we talk about the Renaissance, or at least all the factors that brought historically to arrive to this point. But generally speaking, you say Renaissance and snap, you have Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel in your mind. You think about the great age of exploration. This especially into the British conception of Renaissance that are having arrived later in England compared to other areas of Europe, basically matched with the Elizabethan period. But let's say that the Renaissance, in this sense, and independently from the popular perception, is a term that is used without too much criticism. It's not considered controversial. While we use, we debate on whether, the term Byzantine, for instance, for the Roman Empire of the medieval era is appropriate or not, also because it was born as a pejorative in many ways of the and there is discussion in many terms in history that are used improperly, because, as we will be seeing, the Renaissance wasn't conceived really in these terms. The Renaissance is a word that really comes from the 19th century. You wouldn't think that, but it's the Renaissance, which is the term that the French historian Jules Michelet has created, and therefore a term that wasn't used during the Renaissance period, as obviously many others in other times of history that, however, came to define those very moments of history because later people decided to do so. And I also use the term Renaissance without too much trouble, even though I don't really like it much. I think that this idea of the big Renaissance, etc., is true, is historically correct, but in a certain sense is a too grandiose definition, according to me, for an era that was otherwise very dark in many ways. I mean, we shouldn't think that there are things like bright or dark eras, otherwise we fall into the same very thing I'm criticizing. But I mean, the 15th to 16th centuries were actually pretty harsh times. There were a lot of wars. It was a moment of crisis in many ways. Today we celebrate the turn of the era from the Middle Ages to the modern era, normally with the discovery of America. But and that was something, and especially the encounter with the new populations of the Native Americans was something very shocking at the time in many ways, culturally speaking. But was what was really amazingly terrifying in the Renaissance was actually the fracture of Christianity. At that time, with the Reformation, it was historically much more deeply felt, as together with the Ottoman invasions and other wars and conflicts and moment of crisis at the time. So it wasn't really a very good moment to live in. You can argue that nor what came before or came after was better, but we're talking. The reason why I don't like the term Renaissance so much is that it sticks very much into the humanistic tradition, and it's very elitistic in many ways, because the Renaissance actually defines something that was happening, broadly speaking, in the sciences. In the sense that obviously it was a moment of great progress from a technological, a scientifical, and artistical point of view, which we all know from art, from the age of discovery, from many aspects that permeated world society. But still, you can't really say that it was such a great Renaissance. Perceived at the time, especially, and it's not surprising, in fact, that it's a later invention. I must say that I'm pretty harsh on this definition, also because as a medievalist, I often had debates with modernists regarding the the point of finding a watershed between the Middle Ages and the early modern era. And mostly, I agree that the major difference was mostly political, in the sense that the modern age probably is defined by the nascence, in fact, of that degree of centralization that we normally call as that normally makes us call certain states as modern states. However, that was also very progressive thing, especially in my opinion. It wasn't born really in the modern age, because centralization at various degrees was present even during the Middle Ages, contrarily wise to most people believe. And after all, the major modern states were born by national monarchies very often that already had a degree of structuration and centralized, at least, bureaucracy in certain offices and even control over a certain area. So when we think about the Renaissance, I think that we're strictly, the first thing comes into my mind, it's art. To me, Renaissance is something that I immediately associate with great artists of the 16th century, coming from Italy mostly, but the Renaissance was obviously something that spread in many other countries. There is a beautiful French or even German Renaissance very early in many times, and in fact I'm critical of this idea of the Renaissance as a sort of an old Italian model that somehow kicks out. First of all, that it appears all of a sudden, even in the same Italy. The Renaissance is something that in Italy started very early in time. It's very difficult even to say when it happens. Normally, we define the 15th century as the century of humanism. So really looking at Italy, where objectively there was a huge increase in philological research, a great erudition, the highest form of educations in the entire world. So Italy was very important, but that wasn't really started in the 15th century. Italians had been some of the most educated, if not the most educated, people throughout the whole European Middle Ages, and it's very difficult to see a sparkle of humanistic, of humanism even in the 12th century Renaissance. In Italy, people started, emulating the ancient Latin prose and poetry at a very early stage. Even in the beginning of the 14th century, you have beautiful works written in classical Latin that evidently at least the Italians were perfectly capable of emulating from the ancient sources. So where does humanism start? To me, humanism really starts in the mid of the 14th century proper, with Petrarch, and this very progressive conception of the humanistic ideal of the literate that searches for a huge amount of books, etc. But if you look back in the previous centuries, even those collections of 70 books, or manuscripts, in fact, that you could find in the wealthiest monasteries of Central Europe were, in a certain sense, the same thing. They had less means, so it's right to stress the quantitative dimension of the humanistic literary production and the birth of libraries, for instance, that really occurs in the during the 14th and 15th centuries. But this idea of owning knowledge in large quantities is something that you can find in the whole, at least in the whole European Western world. Not meaning that the others were weren't doing that. As a matter of fact, the Byzantines had much more than eventually came back to the West in terms of knowledge and manuscripts from the ancient world, etc. But I argued that essentially the humanistic minded attitude was there, sometimes hidden, but sometimes really not, throughout the whole Middle Ages. The models were under this, the sight of everyone. Even normally we we name people like Cassiodorus, for instance, of the 6th century, like these last literates that that eventually, after whom kind of the complete darkness happened. But if you really see even during the early Middle Ages, and even in those ages that are supposedly conceived as dark and barbaric, that the at least the elites, which sometimes were relatively modest elites, so this makes honor to them, had actually a great interest in ancient knowledge, and people studied it. Think about at figures like Isidorus of Seville, or Bede the Venerable, or Gregory of Tours, or Paul the Diacon. There was even a count, Carolingian count, Everard of Friuli, in northeastern Italy. That was a place that it didn't have much of an urbanization. It wasn't particularly progress, etc. But although important politically, but this guy read the Romans, he read Vegetius, and he was pretty much jealous of his manuscripts, which were surely something costly in material and therefore economical terms at the time, but that were conceived already at that point, something precious because of the content of their content. So we can't really say that humanism spread, without and regarding the same 15th century. Obviously, Italy was the most progressed country indeed, in culture, in knowledge, etc. But indeed, also France and also Germany had, and other countries in Europe, of course, had, England, Spain, etc. had definitely those preconditions onto which the humanistic culture and the Renaissance could flourish eventually, and more, sooner or later. So this schematization of saying, yeah, when the Renaissance starts at this point, it has these characters. It's very, very restrictive. It's very it's too poor, really. It has to be investigated and it has to be understood the way it is. Another common myth that I don't know why it's still pushed so much today is that it was Eastern knowledge that actually triggered the birth of humanism. This is also completely false, because the reason why so much material eventually came from the Eastern libraries of Constantinople into Italy, especially, wasn't just purely mechanical thing that eventually triggered humanism. But if anything, it proves that the Western society at the time was so highly cultured that strongly required certain material, because the Greek refugees who were fleeing from the Ottoman advance could even bring these manuscripts, and nobody would have read them. If that happened, I don't know, in Finland or in the depth of Russia, probably very few literates would have cared about this material. Instead, the Italians immediately took them and integrated that knowledge with the one they had already created, produced, and collected on their own. So, as you understand, it's really a matter of basis, of ground on which such phenomena would practically occur. And everything is much more complex and complicated, as always, into history. When you learn history, if you are a beginner or if you have already some experience, you probably already know that whoever talks about history has different views, has different opinions. And I really like the diversity of opinion. I couldn't take single thought as a model ever, not just because it was applied by totalitarianisms, but just simply because I would find it terribly boring on its own. But you also have to think that giving simple answers to great historical questions is impossible. And when we teach history, we do it obviously with for the sake of making people having a structure, a method especially. But you can be sure that history is so wide that you can never stop asking and questioning and finding something new. If anything, because, as I was saying, all of us has a different mind, so different perception, different sensitivity, and we all see different things into sources, and even we have different reactions and opinions relatively to these historiographical traditions. So regarding the criticism to the Renaissance, obviously we find even the concept of the Renaissance as the end of the Middle Ages. I personally didn't I'm much more interested about the timeline of the Renaissance, telling the truth in the sense where it was born, etc., because the greatest mistake, for instance, is conceiving the Renaissance as starting in the 16th century. You can argue that at least 15th or 16th century are by large, made of the same paste in many ways. The 15th century might have been less productive than the 16th century in humanistic and scientific terms, but it's still part of the same phenomenon, very broadly meant. And the acceleration that took place during the 15th century was indeed very important. That happened, as we've seen, that started from Italy essentially, and in the 16th century that expands very fast into all the veins of European culture. But another criticism, as I was saying, you can't move, is the idea that the Renaissance is used as a periodizing term as well. I personally I rarely thought about it, in the sense that I come from a country in which there's never been such a conception. As I was saying at the beginning of the video, the periodizing acception given to the Renaissance is mostly something that it's done in the Anglosphere, or possibly even properly in Britain, because the Renaissance arrived later. It arrived substantially in the mid of the 16th century. So that was a very important moment, because it's the same moment in which the Elizabethan era begins. So it's very English to believe that the Renaissance can get along with the Elizabethan era and all that happened later. Also because it's a sort of a parabola of English history that rapidly goes to the top. I mean, this is really the moment in which England rose to power uninterruptedly, with pretty harsh times, like the one of the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution afterwards. But it's very easy from an English perspective to see the Renaissance of England starting from the mid of the 16th century. Then you see England growing in the 16th and the 17th, and then rocketing from the 18th century. But from my perspective, and consequently, what happens is that the Renaissance, in this sense, is conceived as a period in itself, while an era, even an age. While for me, as I was saying, it's mostly an artistical and scientifical movement. It's mostly about it's something that really affected the fields of knowledge, definitely very broadly, and that had a very strong impact all over society. But it's still something very progressive and too much varied in its phenomenologic characters to say, here the Renaissance starts and here the Renaissance ends. To me, it really doesn't make sense. So as a consequence, it doesn't make any sense to even conceive the Renaissance as an age, previously to which there was the Middle Ages, and then it's completely absurd in my opinion, because the Renaissance started, as a matter of fact, from the same medieval society, and you can argue that there is a very substantial continuity of medieval society through the whole the whole modern age in many ways, especially in the early modern one, where in fact the Renaissance is remembered to have occurred. So I have, my watershed is really the first industrial revolution. I mean, to me, the 16th and 17th centuries are so close to the Middle Ages in many ways, and especially to the late Middle Ages, that it doesn't make much sense to me to conceive the second part as these two modern centuries as something substantially different from the previous ones. Indeed, the states grew, new problems kicked in. There is the age of the exploration. There is the fracture of the Christian world with the Reformation. There is the rise of the Ottoman Turks in the Balkans, etc. But in many ways, I see society as largely as a continuation of the medieval one, and what flowed into the cultural veins of Europe is really the Renaissance, but the whole body of Europe is something that really comes straight from the Middle Ages. And it's very interesting from this point of view also, because when you search for myths busting about the Middle Ages, it turns out people, the worst stereotypes about the Middle Ages, like witch hunting, for instance, are something that really occurred most largely, at least quantitatively, during the modern age than the Middle Ages. So you can argue that continuity, however, does exist in many ways. Witch hunting, for instance, is definitely a point of continuity from the Middle Ages, even if it objectively was a much more intense phenomenon into the modern age, indeed. So the whole concept of Renaissance, of civilization, culture, ancient arts, through the belief, especially of through the cause of a sort of breath of puff of innovation that came from we don't know where. It's a bit too poor, really, as a definition, and this is the very reason why today this conception is widely surpassed, historiographically speaking. There is no doubt that already from the 14th century, many aspects of European life and culture had drastically changed. And I think that, not surprisingly, I have this thing with the Black Death, with the plague of 1348, that according to me really changed the face of Europe much more than the same Renaissance itself, or better, that the Black Death and brought to certain social modifications that allowed the Renaissance in many ways to happen, but not because of the Renaissance itself, but rather because I think that with the Black Death there was a great push towards the verticization of society and the progressive social stratification, so that the idea of Messengerism, for instance, so this idea of a high culture that is typically, it's an elitism typical of the humanists, was actually created at that point. Probably if there hadn't been a Black Death, it's possible that the Renaissance in many ways could have happened before, even earlier in time, because if you look at the pre-plague European society, you see that this big society is something that it was much more egalitarian in many ways, much less dogmatic than one would think. And it does resemble, especially the one of certain early modern societies, like the English one, where culture especially scientific or practical knowledge was started to spread within the middle classes and even the lower classes sometimes. So I have this idea that somehow humanism was born at a point in which it was really fueled by people who used these scholars to magnify their origins, their power, their prestige, and that it was a highly literary knowledge. By the way, this is very interesting because even in other moments of history, what we define as the peak of scientific culture, telling the truth, was largely philological. This is true for the Hellenistic era. It's true in part also for the great part of the modern age. You know, before the scientific revolution, especially you know, from between before the scientific revolution, the idea that the scientists were essentially capable of knowing everything. There were these polymatic individuals who knew literally everything that was conceivable, which is, by the way, a medieval mindset, telling the truth, because it was still the ambitions of people in the high Middle Ages to have this omnicomprehensive perception, even if it was in slightly different terms, but it's really where it came from. Still largely had a mostly philological and literary knowledge. I mean, they conceived science as you know, as something to put at the same plan with knowing, I don't know, languages, with knowing history, etc. So the whole meaning, the meaning of the whole world was researched within the correspondences in the various fields of knowledge, especially often in mathematical relation, etc. And what it makes me think it's that these people weren't were usually elite, were usually people who had a lot of money, who had a great education since they were children, but and it was a largely humanistic influenced ideal in many ways, so a very elitistic ideal. It's possible that without the Black Death, European society would have been much more egalitarian in terms of knowledge. It would have not developed the this elitistic idea that just a few guys were the special ones that studied the ancient classical letters and therefore owned who knows which knowledge. In the Protestant countries instead, in Northern Europe mostly, there was a trend reverse during the modern age. Italy was always at the peak of culture and of knowledge up to the 18th century, but in the north of Europe there was a much more egalitarian approach to knowledge. Not that they weren't dogmatic as well, especially in universities, etc., but they were surely much more open to compared to that elitistic idea, humanistic ideal that had settled mostly into Catholic Europe. And therefore, I believe it's very interesting to conceive the Renaissance even under the light of these two different approaches and traditions that even hide very different characteristics of certain societies across Europe, and that really add to much to the diversity of the Renaissance phenomenon compared to what we are used normally to think. So this was just my few, these were my few cents about what I think about the Renaissance in general, what my guts think essentially of the Renaissance. And I'm generally not a fan of made up terms that are not contemporary to the age. Also because in fact they tend to distort the age itself. So the Renaissance, as we normally conceive it, it's something too big to be conceived as such, in my opinion, and it must be much better investigated without wanting to deny that. I don't want to. I didn't mean in this video to say that there was no growth, no expansion, no progress, if you want. Even though that's another word that I don't really like very much, especially from a scientific-minded point of view. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So I thank you for listening. If you arrived until this point, I think I will come back on such topics because you can't exhaust them easily. As I was saying, this was a mainly introductory video. For now, if you like this video, as always, I ask you to share it, or to leave a like, or to subscribe to my channel, simply if you want to receive further content. If you have any question, please write it in the comment or send me an email, and I might take into consideration to even make a video out of your questions now that I'm not so busy. For the rest, as always, I thank you for listening. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.